Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Electricity, as we know it, has been around for several centuries, and yet, in 2024, there's still many parts of the world where people don't have access to it. Here in South Africa, where I'm speaking to you from, blackouts have eased slightly, but that's after years of intensified blackouts which crimped South Africa's economy. And we're not the only ones. On the continent, other African countries are dealing with similar issues. So what could be the solution?
Solar has to be our default go-to technology to resolve the energy crisis in Africa.
The energy source is the sun. It's free.
More and more nations see photovoltaic or PV energy as an opportunity to light up Africa.
Breaking news, you guys. The sun does not shine 24 hours a day.
But is the sun really the answer to power shortages on the continent? And there's also the question of climate change. How can the PV industry produce solar panels resistant to extreme weather conditions? That's what we're going to discuss today with Bloomberg's energy reporter, Paul Burkhardt. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. So let's start by looking at the big picture. Many parts of the African continent are still in darkness, and in some countries, it's very common to have power shortages, as we mentioned. How do you explain that?
If you look across the entire continent, and there's about a population of around 1.2 billion, almost half of that population doesn't have access to electricity. And in the entire world, that number is about 800 million people who live in energy poverty. So the vast majority live in Africa. The amount of people without access to electricity has actually gone up in recent years. Some of that's due to population growth, but a lot of the time it's because people just live in very remote areas and utilities that don't have the resources to connect them already.
Yeah, and that brings us to South Africa, of course, which we talk about quite a bit in this newsroom. But also when you talk about population, not being able to serve the population, Nigeria is also something that comes to mind there. How would you describe the Nigerian situation in particular?
Yeah, Nigeria is really the big one when it comes to outages, and they laugh at South Africa in terms of the power cuts that we have here, because I think it's just become the thing of everyday life there. So almost a third of African countries have more generator capacity than they do like an installed grid capacity. And that's because of the reliance on your own power source. Nigeria is the absolute leader in that. It's up to you as a resident, as a homeowner, or as a business to solve that problem if you live in Nigeria.
But you would think it would be a public good, right? To have electricity, especially when it comes to business, which is why it's surprising that there isn't more investment that has gone towards the sector.
Absolutely. In South Africa, it's even been seen as a right. You should have a right to electricity, or the tools of development should be accessible to everybody. The utility that generates like almost all the electricity in South Africa is Eskom, and it's dealt with a lot of different issues: corruption, mismanagement, depends on bailouts, and Eskom itself believes that it's not charging enough for electricity. So most of all, it's become prone to breakdowns. We've had record power cuts that, again, pale in comparison to Nigeria's, but they're still very bad.
Solar energy will be the dominant source of renewable energy by the end of the decade.
Africa has 10,000 gigawatts of solar potential.
So then, Paul, that brings to light the question about solar, right? I mean, this could be a very obvious answer for these blackouts, especially in many of these countries, which have, I think, a majority of their days are with the sun out, right? Why haven't we seen this tapped as much as it could be?
Yeah, I would say on the positive side, Africa has some of the best solar resources in the world. Namibia, I think, is on the very top of the list. And then there are a lot of other African countries that not only get strong solar power, but they get it year round. But still, it depends on what you're using it for. If it's an industrial application, you can't necessarily do that with solar alone, you would need kind of utility scale batteries. It is used on a limited basis in a lot of places and in remote areas where you can charge your phone or radio, kind of basic things. But it can also work for homes. And what we see in South Africa as there have been more power cuts is they've actually installed up to, I think, 5 gigawatts of solar panels at this point. And so if you have an inverter and you have solar panels, then you can basically get off the grid and you don't have to rely on Eskom. The problem with that is these systems are between 100,000 Rand and 200,000 Rand for the whole thing. And that's more than a lot of South Africans earn in a whole year. So it's just not affordable.
So then we're likely going to see more and more people finding their own ways to power their homes. Essentially, is that sort of the model that is really going to start spreading across the continent? Because as you mentioned, there are some people who can afford it, right, to have solar panels at their homes, but their next door neighbor may not have that. Is it just going to be a broken up grid more and more?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. It's going to create even more inequality in a place like South Africa or Nigeria, because those who can afford to generate their own power, they'll do that. And they have been doing that. And those who can't, and for those who it'll become increasingly expensive, that sort of leaves them in an area where they have to find solutions, and there really aren't many.
Coming up after the break, we'll be looking at the economic potential of the photovoltaic industry for Africa and other renewable energies. We'll be right back.
It is a pretty exciting time to be in the solar industry. Our projections tell us that this year our industry is going to grow by about 52%.
So, Paul, we've seen a number of projects rising up over the years when it comes to solar power. But I wonder, if you take a look at the continent, which country would you say is leading the solar race?
As it stands, it's South Africa. So there was this program that started a little over a decade ago for private developers to build renewable power. And it was very successful until it got blocked for political reasons. But still, South Africa would be much bigger, but that could change pretty quickly. There are opportunities throughout the continent. There's Morocco, Egypt. And if local manufacturing assembly takes hold, then that's really the accelerator. And so they've been looking for that in South Africa. That's really what would cause like a massive change and for projects to be built.
But still, the manufacturing, at least the local manufacturing you're talking about, hasn't yet gained enough steam on the continent. Is that sort of the assessment you'd give it?
That's right. Yeah. I think you see maybe to a small degree some assembly that takes place, but otherwise, like, a lot of this just comes in imported.
What are we hearing, Paul, from the public sector on this? Because this ultimately is affecting these economies, right? Is there enough will to address the grid and the disparities really between who has and who doesn't have power?
We're starting to see a little more of a convergence. We have some of these, there's some foreign funding available, and then that would in turn bring in more private investment. And so we're starting to see more and more of that. South Africa's had a very successful, to some degree, program to bring in more renewables, even going back to 2011. But I think what's accelerated now is the shortages of electricity in South Africa. And so it's really, in a way, it could force more of a solution, but the funding just in large part isn't there. There are grants and there are loans, but there are a lot of other political issues around whether to take some of this money, and just the amount of money that's needed. There's still quite a ways to go.
And that, of course, factors into the climate situation, right? And the effect that is then having on the whole entire situation. I mean, I wonder, in your time since you've been covering this, if you still think that we are on the right track, even given sort of the climate emergencies and the extreme weather events that we're seeing across the continent.
That's a great point, because we see more and more of them here, and Africa is, ironically, is like extremely exposed, more so than a lot of other places, to the effects of climate change. And I think as people experience that, then that firsthand experience it's more of a motivator to change things. But we see these changes when you see some of the issues around, for example, switching from coal for South Africa, and what's going to happen with the mining industry and what happens with those jobs, and where do these jobs in the renewable industry, where will they come from? That needs to be explained. Again, we'll see the private sector really be able to source the power and the electricity that they need. But there's a much bigger issue in a country like South Africa, for example, more than 60 million people. The vast majority are going to be trying to figure out what they're going to do about getting electricity.
What about it being tapped potentially, and I mean solar, Paul, it being tapped potentially as an opportunity for African government? You mentioned how plentiful the resources are, right? Are we at the point yet where some governments can potentially sell their solar access or their solar power to other parts of the world, or are we still in early days?
We see opportunities even within Africa. There's some countries that have looked at exporting electricity the way South Africa used to, really, and now they need all the power that they can get. But there are opportunities. There's certainly opportunities in Morocco and other countries that are so close to Europe.
In the North African desert, one country is embracing this bright future. Morocco has just switched on the world's largest solar power plant. Soon, energy from these skies will be exported to the richest economies in the world, with the potential to transform the lives of millions.
And even in terms of green hydrogen and these other sort of energy options that are coming up, you absolutely can export those things. And yes, the governments can look at this as an opportunity and could find some success. Namibia has quite a bit of discussions going on about their green hydrogen projects, for example. But I think even if you look at energy resources in terms of oil and gas, what African countries still need, if they're exporting these things, are programs at home. What is this doing for your own power supply? So not only do the places that you're sending electricity to have power, but more importantly, that you have power yourself.
Absolutely. And that's what the citizens are waiting for as well. Paul Burkhardt, thanks so much, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you.
As Paul mentioned, the resources are there. The need for the population is as well. What's most pressing at this point is the funding and the will to commit to the solar projects long term, as they do take a long time, as Paul mentioned there. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley and Leon Ouedraogo. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcast. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks, as always, for listening.